Order. I draw honourable members' attention to the fact that our proceedings are being made available for people who are deaf or hearing impaired. The interpreters are using British Sign Language, and Parliament TV will show a live simultaneous interpretation of the debate. We're also trialling live subtitling for the first time on Channel 15 on parliamentlive.tv. Jim Fitzpatrick to move the motion.
Mr String, I beg to move that this House has considered deaf children's services. Mr String, it's a pleasure to see you presiding over this debate today, and I'm grateful to the Backbench Business Committee for granting us time to raise this matter with the Minister. I look forward to his response later, and that of my honourable friend, the Shadow Minister, the Honourable Member for South Shields, and to the SNP spokesperson also. I'm also grateful to colleagues who have supported this bid from the all-party parliamentary group on deafness, and it's good to see a number here today. And finally, as you mentioned, Mr Stringer, I'm grateful to the House authorities for ensuring this debate is transmitted live with signed simultaneous translation. This is surely the future. The title of this debate is Deaf Children's Services. I intend to concentrate on educational support for deaf children, and I'm grateful to the National Deaf Children's Society for their briefing, which will form the bulk of my comments. I believe it's true to say that on education, deaf children are 42% less likely to achieve the top grades than their hearing peers. But there is no reason a deaf child should do any worse than a hearing child, given the appropriate teaching opportunity. And that's the historic perspective. The worry for the deaf community and many colleagues here is not only that the situation is deteriorating, but that it is looking unlikely to improve. Indeed, it could get worse. Further to their educational disadvantages, deaf children can also be more susceptible to mental health issues. NHS England has said that around 40% of deaf children suffer from mental health problems, in contrast to 25% of hearing children. Continuing to adulthood, people with hearing loss are twice as likely to suffer from depression and anxiety-related issues. Investment in early life would more likely lead to healthier adults without the need of employment support or NHS attention. The NDCS in their briefing predict that over one-third of local authorities in England plan to cut £4 million from their budget for education support for deaf children this year. At the same time, the number of teachers of the deaf who provide vital support for deaf children has fallen by 14% over the last 7 years. These figures are drawn from Freedom of Information requests as detailed in the House of Commons Library briefing. The NDCS's Stolen Futures campaign is calling on the government to step in and tackle this growing crisis. These cuts are putting the education of thousands of deaf children at risk, leaving their futures hanging in the balance. Vital services for deaf children must be adequately funded both now and in the next spending review. And it is that review which has caused this debate, Mr Stringer. Statistically, there are more than 50,000 deaf children and young people in the United Kingdom. Over 90% of deaf children are born to hearing parents who have no prior experience of deafness. These parents rely on advice from specialist teachers of the deaf to support their child's language and communication skills. Around 80% of deaf children attend mainstream schools, where they may be the only deaf child. Teachers of the deaf play a key role in helping all teachers to understand how to differentiate the curriculum and provide effective support. Despite the fact that deafness in itself is not a learning disability, deaf children underachieve throughout their education. This is demonstrated in the early years foundation stage, where only 34% of preschool deaf children were reported as having achieved a good level of development compared to 76% of other children. Also at Key Stage 2, less than half of deaf children achieved the expected standard of reading compared to 80% of other children. At Key Stage 4, deaf children achieve on average a whole grade less in each GCSE subject than other children. And in recent years, this attainment gap has widened. And finally, 41% of deaf young people achieve 2 A-levels or equivalent by the age of 19, compared to 65% of other young people. Most deaf children do not have an Education, Health and Care (EHC) plan. The NDCS estimate that less than a fifth, 19% of deaf children, have their support confirmed to a statutory EHC plan. The NDCS have been researching what's happening on the ground. They clearly believe services are under threat. They've been tracking local authorities' spending on specialist education services for the deaf since 2011. This year alone, over a third of local authorities, 37%, have told them that they plan to cut funding for these vital services. Deaf children in these areas will be losing £4 million of support this year, with local authorities on average cutting 10% from deaf children's services. And my own borough of Tower Hamlets, regarded as a model of excellence, with among the highest figures in England for hearing impairment and sound, comments that it is difficult to make fair and equitable decisions for all children with special educational issues. NDCS says that the cuts are likely to affect my local services too. NDCS believes that these cuts are being driven by wider pressure around special education needs and disabilities, SEND, as I mentioned, and the funding. I know the Department for Education has protected high needs funding to support children with SEND in cash terms, but I also know the budget has not been adjusted to reflect several key aspects. Firstly, the rising number of children and the young people requiring additional support. Government figures show, Minister, there were over 30,000 more children in 2017 with statements on education, health and care plans than in the previous year. Secondly, there are greater local authority responsibilities to support young people with SEND aged between 16 and 25, following the SEND reforms introduced through the Children and Families Act of 2014. They have seen significant increases in the number of 16 to 25-year-olds with a statement of SEN or an EHC plan since 2014. And finally, there's a trend towards many more children being placed in special schools. The number of children in special schools rose by 12.5% between 2014 and 2017. The National Deaf Children's Society has published some more background material to back up their concerns. And it's not just the NDCS that says this. Funding pressures have also been recognised by the Local Government Association. They say, and I quote, "We are calling for an urgent review of funding to meet the unprecedented rise in demand for support from children with special educational needs and disabilities. As we head towards the next spending review, the needs of some of the most vulnerable children in society must not be forgotten. A failure to invest in deaf children's futures is likely to result in a generation of lost potential." The NDC raised with us a number of other issues that I know they have already communicated to the Minister and his team. The Department has so far responded that £6 billion is the highest budget on record, and nobody disputes that. But the demand outstrips the supply, and this is the key fundamental question for the Minister to respond to today. It is more, it's the highest it's ever been, but the demand is even higher. And I would be grateful if he would address those figures in his response. There are some other specific issues the NDCS have raised and suggestions that they have put forward. For example, they want to explore with the Department whether the ring fence on the school's block can be relaxed or removed. The national funding formula means that 99.5% of the school's block is now ring fenced. The remaining 0.5% can only be transferred to the high needs block, which funds SEND support services with the agreement of the local schools forum. This ring fencing is making it harder for local authorities to move funding in response to growing SEND pressures. This is evidenced by the large number of local authorities that have applied to the Department for permission to overrule the schools forum locally and or go beyond the 0.5%. The NDCS understand that 27 local authorities made a formal request for disapplication of the ring fence, of which 15 were allowed to proceed. And I'd be grateful if the Minister could comment on those figures and on the principle. I would also welcome the Minister's views on whether there is more we can do to ensure that the local school forums, or fora, include more representation around special educational needs and disabilities. NDCS also want the gaps in the specialised SEND workforce addressed. Teachers of the deaf play a key role in supporting deaf children and their families and other teachers, as I have described. Where services are working well, they ensure that deaf children start primary school with an age-appropriate language and communication skills, and that they are effectively supported and included within mainstream schools. In 2017, there were 913 qualified teachers of the deaf working in a peripatetic role or in resource provisions. This total has fallen by 14% in the past 7 years. In addition, over half of teachers of the deaf are over the age of 50 and hence are due to retire within the next 10 to 15 years. Many services are telling the NDCS that they cannot recruit. In 2017, 45% of services reported difficulties in recruiting new teachers of the deaf or arranging supply cover over the previous 12 months. NDCS believe that a national systemic approach is needed to address this growing crisis. There is little incentive for local authorities to be proactive in ensuring that there are sufficient numbers of teachers of the deaf being trained to meet future needs. Many will not be able to meet the financial costs of training new staff while also employing somebody who is yet to retire. In 2016, the Department for Education commissioned a report from the National Sensory Impairment Partnership on the supplier of specialist teachers. This report also recommended a central bursary scheme. However, the NDCS are not aware of any action being taken in response to this, and again, I'd be grateful if the Minister could indicate if there's any progress in this regard. The NDCS also raised whether there is a way to incentivise or even require local authorities to work together to commission more cost-effective services for deaf children. Given that deafness is a low-incidence need, it's important that local authorities, particularly smaller authorities, work together to commission specialist services and provision. There are too many services employing just 1 or 2 teachers of the deaf trying to meet the diverse needs of deaf children in their area. There are just 9 consortia delivering educational support services for deaf children in England, the largest being in Berkshire. There has been no noticeable increase in recent years in the extent to which services and provisions for deaf children are regionally commissioned, and I'd be grateful if the Minister might comment on that suggestion. The NDCS welcomed the Department asking Ofsted how schools can better be held to account for the support that they give to children with SEND, but they have concerns about whether more could be done to strengthen the accountability framework around specialist services for deaf children. Finally, among the concerns, NDCS raised the question of a review of post-16 funding. SEND funding for mainstream post-16 providers is provided where a young person has been commissioned a place using high needs funding. In practice, this means that in many areas, colleges will only receive funding for young people if they have an EHC plan. Government figures suggest that more than 85% of deaf young people do not have an EHC plan. If SEND funding is, in practice, restricted to those with an EHC plan, this means that a large number of deaf young people are less likely to get the support they need to access the curriculum, such as a radio aid to help with additional application or note takers. The figures indicate that in further education, deaf people are twice as likely to drop out as their peers, and 1/4 don't gain any qualification. Teachers of the deaf are unable to provide advice to mainstream college staff or support young people there, as they are not funded. And again, I would welcome comments from the Minister and whether he be prepared to look at this. Mr Stringer, a number of individuals have been in touch with me directly. My apologies for not being able to mention their cases, but there's just not enough time. There are so many colleagues who want to contribute to this important debate. The House Facebook post for this debate was seen by nearly 64,000 accounts, had over 6,000 post clicks and 1,700 plus engagements covering funding, accessing support, good experiences, geographical differences and lack of understanding, with some very poignant accounts, especially from parents, and I hope the Minister has a chance, if he hasn't had already, to view them. In conclusion, Mr Stringer, there are some very, very able deaf young people out there who can be huge assets to UK POC. If we don't allow them to develop, if we don't encourage and support them as they mature, we are not just denying them their birthright, but we're robbing our country of a significant contribution from some highly skilled and intelligent individuals. We owe them more than that. Thank you.
The question is that this House has considered deaf children's services. Right, there are 8 people standing. There is 45 minutes, so I'm not going to impose a time limit straight away. I hope people will do the arithmetic and follow that time limit. If they don't, I will have to impose a time limit. Peter Aldous.
Thank you very much, Mr. Stringer. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. I congratulate my honourable friend, the member for Poplar and Limehouse, on securing this debate and for the unstinting work that he does on behalf of the deaf and hard of hearing community. I also welcome the Minister to his place. I would like to start by talking about some of the challenges faced by deaf children in Suffolk, where there is a dissatisfaction with services in the north of the county. The National Deaf Children's Society point out that there has been a loss of 4 teachers of the deaf in the county since 2011. Suffolk County Council have also discontinued the running of an integrated specialist service for deaf children that brought education and care together. This service was praised and singled out by Ofsted as being a good example of good practice in a thematic review they carried out in 2012. There does not appear to have been any assessment carried out of the impact on deaf children of removing this service. More widely, its removal goes against the emphasis in the special education needs and disability reforms on joint working and commissioning. There is a concern, Mr. Stringer, that local authorities across England are being put under pressure to reduce services as a result of short-term budgeting constraints at the cost of the long-term future of deaf children. I've raised these concerns with Suffolk County Council, who are aware of the problem. They highlight that all services for children with disability and special education needs are significantly under-resourced nationally across both the education and health sectors. They point to a projected 18 to 20% increase in SEND demand. The lack of funding impacts on resources for deaf children alongside all others with SEN. With the national new funding formula for SEND, Suffolk receives less funding than other similar areas. Although the county has been awarded some additional funding, this has been capped at a rate which means that the county only receive half of the extra funding they should be receiving each year. This is a shortfall of £1.5 million per annum. In terms of speech and language services provided by the NHS, which support deaf and hearing impaired children, there has been a 21% rise in demand in the last 3 years, but no significant change in the level of offer for community health services. This will get worse as a further 10% increase in demand is projected by 2020. This has a negative knock-on impact to the County Council, as where the NHS is unable to provide the necessary resources, the county, as the local educational authority, becomes the funder of last resort, thereby putting further pressure on their already under-resourced education budget. Suffolk, Mr. Stringer, are looking to put resource bases into mainstream schools to address the needs of deaf children. This will enable a child with a specialist need to access a mainstream offer, and generally I believe this is the right approach. I will give way to my honourable friend.
Thank you, Mr. Stringer. I'm grateful to the honourable gentleman for giving way and to my honourable friend for securing this debate. In my constituency, the Notty Ash Primary School provides such a deaf resource base for 14 profoundly deaf children. It is a huge boon for those children, but also for the hearing children in the mainstream school, all of whom learn British Sign Language.
I thank the honourable friend for that intervention, and from the resource bases that are in Suffolk, both in primary schools and in secondary schools, they are very, very popular and go down very well. And the feedback I get from students, from pupils who are not deaf, they actually welcome that, and they are incredibly proud of the young people in those units. The problem in Suffolk, Mr. Stringer, is there are 3 resource bases at primary level in Ipswich, Bury and in Lowestoft, but at secondary level there is only a resource base in Bury St Edmunds, and these do need to be put out across the whole county, particularly in the northern area. My honourable friend, the member for Poplar and Limehouse, is a champion for the deaf and the hard of hearing community. it is important from my perspective to highlight the sterling work of another such champion, Anne Gillings from Lowestoft, who has been working tirelessly with passion and determination to secure the best possible education for her son Daniel. In doing so, she is campaigning for other parents of deaf children in North Suffolk. Anne chairs the Waveney Deaf Children's Society and, along with Daniel, has been campaigning for the introduction of a GCSE in British Sign Language as soon as possible. They made their case firmly and passionately, but politely, to the Minister's ministerial colleague, the Right Honourable Member for Bognor Regis and Littlehampton, at a meeting in March. I do hope that the Department for Education will continue to do as much as they can to support the development of this new GCSE, and I would welcome the Minister's reassurance on that point. Daniel was born deaf. Following diagnosis through the newborn hearing screening programme, Anne received support from a person who she describes as a fantastic teacher of the deaf who acted as an advocate for the family as Daniel grew up. He has been able to make excellent progress throughout his education. Anne is very clear that this is because of the support that he received from both specialist teachers of the deaf and communication support workers. This confirms that provided deaf children receive the right support right from the start, there is no reason why they cannot thrive and break through any glass ceilings that might get in their way. Getting this support for Daniel has been a challenge, and Anne comments that she has fought tooth and nail for it, putting the whole family under incredible stress. She highlights that it took 50 weeks to complete the transfer from a Statement of Education, Health and Care Plan, from a statement to an Education, Health and Care Plan. This is more than twice the statutory deadline. She points out that initially the local education authority did not agree with the advice that Daniel would need to continue to have support from a teacher of the deaf in his school, and it was only when she stated that she would take up her right of appeal was it accepted that a full-time teacher of the deaf was needed. She says, getting the support for your deaf child is a battle which parents should not have to fight. And I do wonder what happens to those children whose parents cannot persevere in the same way that we have. Mr. Stringer, I've got a lot to say, but I sense I'm stopping others from thinking. I was going to raise...
Gentlemen, there was roughly 5 minutes 30 for everybody if they self-allocated. The Honourable Gentleman's now on 6 minutes 30.
I thank the Honourable Mr. Stringer for guiding me. I will cut to the chase. I will conclude. I will end those remarks, my comments, by what I said at the end of the debate last November in this chamber on deafness and hearing loss. Many barriers have been placed in the way of Anne Gillings in her pursuit of her goal for better education for Daniel. It is our duty, and the duty of government, and the duty of local authorities to remove those barriers as soon as possible. Thank you for bearing with me, Mr. Stringer. Thank you very much. I think it was probably easier if I impose a 5-minute time limit on speeches now. Stephen Lloyd.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, and also my colleague, the Member of Parliament Poplar and Limehouse, who I've known for a long time, and it's a pleasure to serve with him and the all-party parliamentary group of deafness. I appreciate him getting this important debate. We've got 5 minutes, so I'll try not to repeat anything that's already been said, other than I do want to thank the National Deaf Children's Society for their campaign, Our Stolen Futures. That's many reasons, or a key reason why most of us are here. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank a school of my own constituency, Willingdon Community School, which is a fantastic institution, fantastic school. It's got a unit for deaf and hard of hearing children, and I've been there many times, and I've always been a big fan of it. Deafness is a funny disability, and I say that as someone who's been hard of hearing since I was about 6. I've been involved for many, many years in various areas, from being trustee of the RNID, patron of British Society of Hearing Therapy, loads and loads of other things in between. And at the ripe old age of 61, I've concluded it's still an interesting disability. And I don't mean that facilely. I mean, I would have thought at the age I'm at and the involvement that I've had over the years in many areas of deafness, there would be a quantum leap and improvement
for the opportunities for deaf people. And in some ways that's happened. In other ways, there's almost no advance at all. What I mean by that when I say deaf is I mean either profoundly deaf or severely hearing impaired. And that's very different from someone like myself, who's hard of hearing, but with the facility of a hearing aid, it's almost, relatively speaking, no barrier at all. If you're profoundly deaf or have a severe hearing loss, because our world is a world of communication, if you cannot communicate, either you cannot hear what people are saying or they're not able to communicate with you, it is an enormous barrier. And that's where teachers of the deaf play such an important role, because I've seen over the years children who have had good teachers of the deaf or adequate provision who have gone on to lead very fulfilling, successful lives and careers, and others where they didn't have that opportunity, where frankly they've ended up with, through no fault of their own, but lives mostly spent on benefit or low-paid work, and it's not a reflection at all in their intellect or ability. It's because of the barriers of deafness, and they weren't helped at the right times. So to know, because of various reasons, the percentage of teachers of the deaf is dropping, to learn that a substantial percentage are over 50, which means they'll be approaching retirement in the next few years, really does worry me a great deal. So I'll be looking forward to hearing from the Minister how the government proposed to deal with that, because I can say with absolute conviction, based on years and years of experience, that if deaf children, I mean profoundly deaf or severely deaf children, aren't supported at the right time in early years, then they almost have no chance at all. Particularly bearing in mind that 90% of the time, profoundly deaf children are born to hearing parents. When that happens, if they have no experience of it, it is an absolute shattering blow. And I'm genuinely not exaggerating. I've seen it so many times. And that's where a good trained teacher of the deaf not only can help the child acquire the communication skills, which means that they will be able to maximize their ability, but actually plays a crucial role with the parents in support, because it is literally, when that does happen to hearing parents, it is like hitting a wall. So this is a terribly important campaign, and I'm very, very keen to support it. I'd also like to, in my limited time, focus on one particular ask, which is the review of post-16 funding. The theory is that there will be enough funds to actually support deaf children from 16 to 18 as they go into FE, further education. I would urge the Minister that he looks at the report, because it is clear there is an anomaly or a gap between what is supposed to happen and what is happening. If you get a child or a young person to 16, and then they go to FE and there's no support and they're profoundly deaf, then I can tell you, Minister, again, I've seen it many times, they will immediately go backwards, and that would be a terrible waste. So I would urge that the Minister also consider the part of the review post-16 funding. Thank you.
Mike Penning.
And again, I congratulate, like others will do all through the afternoon, my former colleague, but now colleague in this House, the Honourable Member for Poplar and Limehouse. We agree on so many things, and yet again we'll agree on this one. And he brilliantly read and based his speech on the National Deaf Children's Society summary, which they sent out, and I congratulate them. And their timing is perfect as we now look at funding formulas going forward and what allocations are going to be given out. At this stage, I must declare that I've, for many years, been the Hertfordshire Hearing Advisory Service patron, so it's not something I'm new to, and they asked me just after I became an MP, when I actually mentioned in passing one afternoon that I have a hearing impairment from my military service, which I must admit I didn't tell the fire service when I joined. Fortunately, I'm now out of the fire service and I can do it. I'm not going to go over the many issues that have been raised. I agree with nearly everything that's been said. SEN provision is a real difficulty in all our constituencies. How they're assessed, how long it takes for them being assessed, getting an EHC plan in place, massively difficult. And then that must now, Minister, carry on into what this government quite rightly have done, is moved it into provision into 25. and the report clearly does show that there are anomalies and issues there. I want to just, in the short time I have, Mr. Stringer, just talk about two things. British Sign Language for this country is a language. It's a language the same as any other language that we use or we're lucky enough to use. In some cases, the only language that they have. And yet you can't get a formal qualification. You can't get an O-level. This is fundamentally wrong and discriminatory against people for no fault of their own. That is their language. Yes, we have 80%. I think it's a fantastic figure, actually, in our mainstream schools that people have deafness or learn, profound deafness or hearing disabilities. But in the teachers that are being trained today, and I declare an interest again, I have a daughter that's a primary school teacher that went through a PGCE 4 years ago. The two things that shocked me, absolutely shocked me, is she had half an hour of PE in a whole year, teaching her how to take PE lessons, and absolutely nothing to do with deafness of young people that she, obviously, with 80% of them in mainstream schools, she's likely to be teaching. I haven't asked her permission to speak here on her behalf today, but I'll be speaking on behalf of lots of other teachers. It would cost the government absolutely nothing as part of the BEd or the post-qualification PGCE or the new ways of teaching that come through. That basic British Sign Language is there, not because they're going to have pupils in their school, but they almost certainly might have later on. At the moment, if a school doesn't have someone that would need that sort of help, often the teachers are sent away. Or they do it in their own time, off their own cost, of their own provision. Fantastic. But surely, in the 21st century, when we're training a diversity of teachers, and we want more and more people to be in mainstream schools, that we must understand what their needs and provisions are. And the figures are shocking, that if we do not give basic support, that is not a replacement for, a deaf advisor, but actually to be able to communicate, good morning, how are you, how do you feel today, did you watch the football at the week? Just that sort of normality that we all take for granted for a young person in school, to me, is fundamentally wrong. And it wouldn't cost the Department of Education, I think, a single farthing, because you just add it into the curriculum and perhaps take something out, which isn't. 90% of the education training for teachers, especially at PGCE, is done in schools. But they do not, as a provision, make sure that the teachers go into a special needs school as part of that one-year PGCE. Why not, I asked the Minister, because that seems to me obviously logical. Why do you retrain them again should they go through when so many children need that special education needs and need the EHC reports? For me, it is absolutely fundamental that if this House and this government, which I'm very proud of, wants to treat people in a civil way and look at people on an equal way, an equalities way, young people that need help should have at least the basics of being able to take a qualification, and it is fundamentally wrong in this day and age that they end up with qualifications less than their peers sitting next to them simply because the provision wasn't next to them. That is wrong.
In Greenwood.
Thank you, Mr. Stringer. It's always a pleasure to serve under the chairmanship of my select committee colleague. I'd like to begin by congratulating my honourable friend, the member for Poplar and Limehouse, on securing this debate and for so comprehensively and effectively setting out the issues facing deaf children. I know how passionate he is about this issue, and he's a great advocate for the deaf community in this place. And I think it's really important that the focus of today's debate is services for deaf children. Children's voices aren't often enough heard in this place, and it's right that we talk about them. And of course, I'm absolutely delighted that Parliament is making today's debate accessible for all those who might want to follow it live, and I hope this will be rolled out more widely. Mr. Chairman, there are 282 deaf children in the city of Nottingham. The majority of them attend their local mainstream school and are supported by the sensory team at Nottingham City Council. However, Furbeck Academy in Nottingham is a mainstream primary school in the north of the city which has specialist provision for up to 12 deaf children. It's actually in the constituency of my colleague, the Honourable Member for Nottingham North. All the children in the school are surrounded by British Sign Language in classrooms and assemblies, and many of the hearing children go up signing and could communicate with their deaf classmates using BSL. In addition to ensuring that deaf children are getting an excellent education at the school, many parents also require support from outside agencies, and that might range from the BSL teacher, speech and language therapist, doctors, social care, audiology services, to name a few. Managing those relationships adds to the extra increasing workload of the 2 full-time teachers of the deaf at the school. They're increasingly spending more time out of the classroom, juggling budgets and timetables because the school's overall budget has been reduced. They're striving to do their best by the children, but they told me it's the same old story. If the government want an outstanding education system, there needs to be more funding for schools. And they're concerned that many SEN children's needs are not being met due to lack of funding. Now, Fairbeck's been set up with specialist deaf provision and they're struggling. I'm concerned for those schools who don't have the same setup as Fairbeck, yet provide education for a deaf child. How can the Minister be confident that they and their families are getting the support they need to thrive? And looking to the future of deaf children's education, Mr Chairman, as my honourable friend said, 57% of peripatetic teachers of the deaf are over the age of 50 and insufficient new trainees are being brought through. The training itself to become a teacher of the deaf has been reduced from 1 year full-time or 2 years part-time, which is less than in many other countries. And that means that some topics can't be covered in detail and some not at all. There's no requirement for continued professional development and very little budget to support it. So I hope the Minister can tell us in his response what's being done to recruit more teachers of the deaf to ensure the quality of their training. And what can he assure us in relation to all teachers that their mainstream training, if you like, is properly alerts them to the needs of deaf children and how to meet them? Now, while some children cope very well in mainstream education, others struggle in this setting. Nottinghamshire Deaf Society tell me that in their experience, too many children don't get the specialist support they need, that they find communication difficult and, of course, leave school with lower attainment. They also told me that they can lack a sense of identity and so miss out on the support and richness of deaf culture, and I think that's worth addressing. Mr Chairman, it's not just educational services that deaf children need access to, there are health services they rely on too. The NICE guidelines on acceptable criteria for cochlear implants are now out of date and out of step with most developed countries such as the US and Australia. Lots of parents are understandably frustrated by this. They know that their child's not really reaching their potential with hearing aids, but they don't meet the UK criteria for implants. Over the last year, the Ear Foundation, which is a charity in my constituency, has lobbied NICE to review this guidance so that clinical discretion can be applied in the best interests of the children. And I hope the Minister will liaise with his colleagues in the Department of Health to see what benefits access to that technology could bring for deaf children. I'm conscious of the time. I would also hope that the Minister can tell us a little bit about what's happening to ensure that deaf children or deaf young people get access to proper careers, information, advice and guidance that helps them as they enter the world of work, because we know, of course, that poorer educational opportunities also means poorer opportunities for life, and that impacts on things like mental health and isolation, as my honourable friend has said. I look forward to the Minister's response.
Shannon.
Thank you, Mr Stringer. First of all, can I also congratulate the Honourable Gentleman for Poplar and Limehouse for bringing this forward. There would be some things that we disagree on, but I tell you what, there's a whole lot more that we agree on, and this is certainly one of them, and I look forward to supporting him in this debate, as I often do in many debates that he brings forward, and likewise, to be fair, so does he to me as well. There is nothing more frustrating than not being understood. There are times, most especially at the beginning of my Westminster journey that I had in here, that I would be speaking to people in this place and they would look at me searchingly, wondering, trying to get past my accent. Maybe that still is one of those issues, I'm not quite sure, but I think everyone here hopefully can understand it. I think the Honourable Member for Vauxhall says Jim Shannon gets more words to the minute than any other MP. Now, I'm not quite sure what she means by that, but I think I probably know what she's saying. So it's slow it down. So I've tried over the last few years to try and slow it down. But I can understand it is frustrating to the extreme. And I cannot imagine the frustration of deaf people who find it difficult to understand and to be understood, and the frustration of those who love them, knowing that there's very little help and support offered to them through the education system, or indeed, as the Honourable Lady referred to, through the health system either. I want to refer just very quickly to Northern Ireland, and Mr. Stringer, I know that that's not the responsibility of the Minister, but just to give you a flavour for what's happening there. Some 3,500 British Sign Language speakers and some 1,500 Irish Sign Language speakers in Northern Ireland, but just 30 registered interpreters. This tells you immediately there's an issue with being heard in Northern Ireland for those who are deaf. There are some 1,400 deaf children, and if you do a quick figure on that, that's 46 deaf children per teacher. So it just doesn't add up. It's impossible to try and deliver a system varying from the moderate to the profound hearing loss. I read an interesting article in the Belfast Telegraph some 6 months ago on this very topic, and the prognosis was not good. Despite a 25%, in the last 7 years, there's been, despite a 25% increase in the number of deaf children, the number of specialist teachers with deaf has been reduced by 16%. And 61% of those teachers are due to retire in the next 10 to 15 years, a very issue that the Honourable Lady bring up and others have spoken about as well. The Scotland and Northern Ireland Director for the National Deaf Children's Society has said, in Northern Ireland we have some 1,400 deaf children. Out of these, 71% of them are currently educated in mainstream schools. In these schools, the staff require support from teachers who have the specialism to be able to deal with those deaf children. Additional support would allow trained staff to educate teachers on the awareness and the communication needed for deaf children. It would also allow for one-to-one tuition, if required, and organised specialist technology for the pupils. Those teachers help the children to integrate, and they help the teachers to help the children to integrate as well. So it's a dual support, and we have to remember that as well. It's not just about being heard, it's about being part of the group of pupils at school as well. A great opportunity here because of the 5 education and library boards in Northern Ireland being consolidated into one education authority, and hopefully we can then have in Northern Ireland a wide approach in addressing the whole of the issues across the whole of Northern Ireland. We'd like to see a plan to train new teachers of the deaf, so we have new teachers coming through to replace those who retire in the near future. And we'd like a recruitment drive, a very important recruitment drive, to get more into the classroom. At the moment, because of the increase of children who are deaf, along with the reduction in teachers, we will soon have in the workforce, we would like to see the education for deaf children recognised as a priority. I couldn't agree more with this. The numbers are increasing and we do not have the capacity. And we don't have a minister in office either to bring about policy change at this moment in time. We look forward to the possibility that may happen, but whenever we return on the 15th of October, there will be some things coming before this House and before the MPs, and the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland is beginning the process of bringing new legislation to this place to allow senior civil servants to make policy decisions. This can't come soon enough. A recent study found deaf children are falling behind their hearing classmates due to funding cuts, and unfortunately it's also something we have to consider. Only 40% of deaf students achieve 2 A levels, compared with 65% of those who had normal hearing. The National Deaf Children's Society attributes this to an attainment gap to year-on-year cuts. Only 9% of deaf students attend a Russell Group university, for instance. Again, an indication of where the fall down is. We are failing them. We are failing to understand their needs, and this must change. Thomas Edison, thanks to whom this room is lit with electric light bulbs, had scarlet fever in his youth and therefore was severely hearing impaired. But look what he did without what we have today. Can I just say, really, it takes effort. Minister, you're in your place again, and you've had a hard week of it. You've been in this place 3 times to reply to debates. But we really do need to have an emphasis from your department, and I say it here kindly to you in the mainland, but also for us back home in Northern Ireland as well. The two can exist together, hearing impaired and excelling if the right effort is put into the process. I want to be heard and understood. So do the deaf children need to be heard. Everyone has a right. We must do better.
Thank you, Mr. Stringer. It's an honour to serve under your chairmanship. Mr. Stringer, on the 5th of March this year, I had the great privilege of presenting a debate in response to the e-petition on making British Sign Language a part of the curriculum. Much of that debate was about giving deaf children the best possible chance of communicating with other people, but also being able to have the best educational outcomes that they can have, something which is not sadly happening at present, as the evidence of attainment shows. And today I want to talk about the issue of services for deaf children at a much earlier stage in the education system. And I'm sorry to have to do that, because the latest figures show that services to deaf children are reducing across England, meaning that their futures are, as the National Deaf Children's Society puts it,
being stolen. Stolen because without the support and intervention and specialist skills which they need, they will not be able to make the best educational and social progress that they could make in comparison with other children who are not deaf or hearing impaired. And Mr Stringer, that simply cannot be right. There are more than 50,000 deaf children and young people in the UK, over 90% of them, as we've heard, born to hearing parents who have no prior experience of deafness. And some 80% of these children attend mainstream schools, where they may be the only deaf child in their school. Figures from the National Deaf Children's Society show a stark difference in educational achievement as it is. In the early years foundation stage, 34% of preschool deaf children were reported as having a good level of development, compared to 76% of other children. At Key Stage 2, less than half of deaf children achieved the expected standard for reading, compared to 80% of other children. At Key Stage 4, deaf children achieve, on average, a whole grade less in each GCSE subject than other children. In recent years, this attainment gap has widened, and 41% of deaf young people achieved, as we've heard, 2 A-levels or equivalent by the age of 19, compared to 65% of other young people. This is not a gap of intelligence, Mr Stringer. This is a gap in having the support and the tools to communicate and understand as other children do. And where do they sit in the system of special needs? Well, most of them don't have an education, health and care plan. The NDCS estimates that less than 1/5 of these children have a plan which sets out their supported needs. And of course, most schools do not have the knowledge or skills to support the children themselves. So access to specialist support is absolutely essential if they are to be able to learn and develop. And that support, because deafness is a low incidence need, is best provided by teams of experts, especially teachers of the deaf, centrally organised within education services, who can go out and provide support and advice to teachers, families and the children themselves. Department for Education research from just last year has shown that specialist education services for deaf children play a crucial role in advising mainstream teachers and ensuring that the needs of deaf children are met. They're funded through the high needs block of the dedicated school grant. It's essential that this service is provided centrally to help deaf children achieve in school. As the National Deaf Children's Society says, it's essential that schools are funded in a way which allows for this early intervention, not just at school, but also preschool, so that families and children can be given the best advice. So it's worrying, as we've heard, that local authority spending on specialist education services for deaf children has been reducing since 2011. And that includes in my own authority of Gateshead, where there has been a 17% reduction in the budget for this current year. And I know that Gateshead, like many other councils, has done its best to protect funding for these specialist services. So we've heard from the Honourable Member for Poplar and Limehouse about the pressures on funding and also the asks of the National Deaf Children's Society. And they are asks which I would endorse. The first thing I would say, though, is what we need as we approach the comprehensive spending review is additional funding for local authorities, for education services, to be able to provide these very essential services. We've already heard some of the detailed requests that the National Deaf Children's Society have made. But I would say, Mr Speaker, that I've met some incredible people in the course of the last year, from Erin, who I met last year, who's pushing for a GCSE, to Ella, who messaged me this week. And it's important that we give them the time they need.
Thank you, Mr Stringer, and it's a pleasure to speak under your chairmanship, and I congratulate the Honourable Member for Poplar and Limehouse for securing this important debate. I pay homage to the Deaf Children's Society and the work they are carrying out through their Stolen Futures campaign. Mr Stringer, earlier on this year, I had the honour of being invited to visit the Sunnyside Academy in Middlesbrough, where some of my constituents are employed and where deaf or hard of hearing children from Hartlepool receive an excellent education. Sunnyside is a mixed-sex primary school servicing over 350 children aged between 3 and 11. And to say my eyes were opened when I visited the place is an understatement. It truly was a magnificent experience to interact with the children, to visit their classrooms and talk to teachers and support staff. I particularly enjoyed the magical experience of a science storytelling and book reading session provided by one of my constituents. I was simply blown away by the experience and impressed by the enthusiasm of both staff and pupils. The learning environment at Sunnyside is without question happy, comfortable and inclusive, but it made me think of two things. One, what type of experiences will the children have when they move to their secondary schools? And two, are there sufficient resources, sign language users and teachers of the deaf in our school system to support these pupils? Sadly, according to the Our Stolen Future campaign, the answer to the latter is no. In Hartlepool, there are around 615 deaf children receiving support from the Specialist Educational Service for deaf students. The borough is part of a group of local authorities who jointly provide and commission services, but with over a third of local authorities in England planning to cut £4 million from their education support budgets for deaf children this year, the detrimental impact is likely to be significant. This year the service is being reviewed and it is vital that the feelings of both parents and young people are taken into account. To help my constituents get the best education they can, this review has to lead to improvements and factor in a growing demand for support from children with special educational needs. Mr Stringer, what I saw at Sunnyside enthused me. I can only hope that the work of the teachers there is not in vain. It is important that we get the right resources and support in place to help students throughout their school career, which is why I fully support the National Deaf Children's Society's campaign. Thank you.
Aaron Jones.
Thank you, Mr Stringer. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, and may I pay my gratitude to my honourable friend, the member for Poplar and Limehouse, for securing this debate, not least because it gives me an opportunity to put the case on behalf of so many of my constituents who have been in touch about this issue in Bristol North West. They and I are grateful for the opportunity. In Bristol North West, I'm privileged with a specialist provision called Elmfield School for Deaf Children that provides specialist services to early years and primary level pupils in a specialist setting, but with plans to integrate into a mainstream setting, and secondary provision already integrated into Fairfield Mainstream School, also in my constituency. And they provide the full range of services with signed bilingual educational approaches and individual language profiles for each pupil, which I'll come on to in a second to say why it's so important. But Elmfield School, much like others, are struggling to meet demand. In the southwest, where we have over 3,000 pupils who are deaf, there's been a 16% drop in the number of fully qualified teachers of the deaf and a 12% drop in teachers training to become fully qualified teachers of the deaf. And that's why at provisions in Bristol and elsewhere, where there are vacancies, there are no guarantees that these specialist provisions will be filled. I want to thank two constituents who we picked at random from a number of families that got in touch, Mr. and Mrs. Ward and Mr. and Mrs. Bolton, and I'm going to spend the rest of my speech using their stories. So firstly to the Boltons, Ella is the daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Bolton. She's in year 1 and is 6 years old and has moderate hearing loss, which was diagnosed at birth, and she wears hearing aids in both ears. Her mum describes her rightly, having met Ella, as a confident, creative, brave girl who loves learning. She is bright and expected to do well. But because of Ella's level of hearing loss, the fact she appears to cope well in school means that her disability is often overlooked when in a mainstream setting. The perception that it's not a serious condition or that she's coping or performing well means that the provision that she requires to fulfill her potential is often missed. That's because Ella has to put extra effort into hearing in the classroom, which gives her concentration fatigue, having to focus so much on her teachers to be able to engage. She's exhausted most days when she comes home, and her mum says it takes until Sunday evening for her to fully recover before starting again on the Monday morning. Mrs. Bolton says that deafness is not naturally understood by teachers, even with the best will in the world. And Ella is an example of why specialist provision is so much required. But as has already been said today, it's not just about young people, it's about their families too. And Mrs. Bolton was saying to me how the teachers of the deaf helped the family come to terms with having a child who is deaf and how to best support her at home and at school. And she says here that teachers of the deaf played a pivotal role in providing and coordinating support and promoting deaf awareness amongst other staff and providers to Ella, but also to their family. And moving to the Ward family, whose son Ollie is much older and is further down the track, they said that he's had a very mixed journey and what felt like a narrowing and limiting of choices as he got older and progressed through the system. Mrs. Ward says that the specialist teachers of the deaf made a huge difference to Ollie everywhere he went, not just in terms of educational provision, but in terms of the way he navigated life socially in a mainstream setting. And it says here that teachers of the deaf were his lifeline on so many occasions. Ollie then had some moving around, a specialist and mainstream provision in secondary school, which provided him with difficulties. And Mrs. Ward quite rightly makes the point here that she was told by a teacher that her son had outstanding GCSE results for a deaf child. And she makes the point that that shouldn't be a distinction, that just because you're deaf doesn't mean that a C is an outstanding grade when you have the full potential to reach an A. And Mrs. Ward says here that teachers of the deaf navigate schools and classrooms in no end of subtle and clever ways to get the best out of her child Ollie and so many children that we want to see flourish and do well. I look forward to the Minister's answers. There is cross-party support to get this right. I know that the Minister will have heard the story of my constituents and that of local authorities who, on the front line, in reality, are really struggling to do the best, not just in children who are deaf, but in, as we've heard, children with special educational needs, where the struggle to get these EHCP plans in place. So many of my constituents face that challenge. And then the schools have to top up the money they get, and they can't really afford to do that either. It's a real slog. Parents and teachers and local authority staff and councillors are passionate to get the best and to allow deaf children and children with special needs to flourish. And I look forward to the Minister saying how he's going to help them do that today.
Thank you. The restraint on interventions and on the speeches themselves has meant we've gained a couple of minutes. So for the front bench spokespeople, it will be a generous 10 minutes, just marginally over. Angela Crawley.
Thank you, Mr Stringer. It is a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, and I would like to congratulate the Honourable Member for Poplar and Limehouse on securing this debate on services for deaf children and for, of course, his sustained and dedicated campaigning on this matter. Now, I'd also like to welcome the fact that the House has made suitable accommodation and made this accessible for everyone today, and I welcome everyone who's here and at home watching this. It should be the standard practice, and I would hope that it's something that we can look to do. Now, this is an important debate in that we are looking at a section of society with particular needs that require specialist support, and where the support is available for children and young people, they can achieve just as much as their hearing counterparts. However, where the support is not given, there is evidence, as we've heard today, that children can lag behind, and that is simply not sufficient. Now, I think I would like to, of course, acknowledge some of the notable contributions so far from the Honourable Member for Limehouse and Poplar, who outlined the statistics, and the Honourable Member for Eastbourne, who rightly highlighted his own experience, and I think that's very welcome to hear that in this place. The Honourable Member for Hemel Hempstead rightly highlights the issue of equalities, and this is an issue of equalities of outcome, and something that I think we can always strive to do more on. And as ever, the Honourable Member for Strangford, who as ever represents Northern Ireland and speaks to his constituents and all of those who've contributed to today's debate. You've done your constituents a service indeed. Now, where the support for young people is not given, you can see already in the statistics and the evidence that clearly in studies on educational attainment, it proves conclusively that this is an area that we must pay more attention to. Now, this debate has looked at the provisions for deaf children primarily in England, and with as my counterpart from Strangford has outlined, the powers for education have been devolved in Scotland and other areas. So I would like to simply highlight briefly that in Scotland, 57,000 people with severe or profound deafness have been identified, and 701,000 with mild and moderate deafness. Now, many of these people are over the age of 60 with hearing that has deteriorated with age. However, additionally, and it also includes 2,000 deaf and blind people in Scotland. But every year, 75 babies are born deaf in Scotland, and of these, around 5 are born with severe to profound hearing loss. That means there's an estimated 3,000 children and young people under 25 with severe to profound deafness in Scotland, and approximately 34,800 across the whole of the UK. That's 9 out of 10 deaf children having parents, many of whom have no experience of deafness. And this shows just how important specialist services exist to these children. As in England, there is a fear that educational attainment in Scotland will fall due to the declining numbers of specialist teachers, and we've already heard about the constraints on local authorities and funding services. Now, indeed, there is a clear attainment gap for children from the deaf community across the UK, and while deaf pupils can achieve as much as their hearing peers with the right support, evidence shows that pupils with any degree of deafness score below the average academic scores, particularly in language subjects. Now, early years is crucial for children's development, and for deaf children it is important that they are supported through the additional barriers that can delay development. One such challenge is the development of age-appropriate language for children as they experience communication barriers, as deaf children may struggle with social interaction and everyday communication, while most children pick up during their early years through the exposure to language around them. Deaf children can be up to 3 to 5 years behind other children. This can make it difficult for them to understand and recognise simple things like sarcasm and humour when their hearing peers begin to develop this sort of language and understanding. Now, as outlined by the National Deaf Children's Society, there has been good progress in Scotland, particularly around the British Sign Language Scotland Act 2015 and the implementation of getting it right for every child. However, I recognise that there is always more to do, and we must do more across the UK to tackle this issue. Many of the deaf children in my constituency are lucky to be able to attend the Hamilton School for Deaf, which is situated in my neighbouring constituency of Hamilton West and Rutherglen. The school is run by the local authority of South Lanarkshire, which has a commitment to deaf children in our community. Pupils work in classes of no more than 6 children, allowing intensive training specifically tailored to each children's needs. Each class is led by a qualified teacher on deaf and supported by classroom assistants with excellent signing skills. The school campus is shared with the neighbouring school of Glenleigh Primary School, allowing some of the curriculum to be shared with hearing peers, meaning children are not secluded from other children their age. It is deeply important that children with additional needs are given the requisite support to allow them all of the opportunity that their hearing peers, and I join my honourable members and colleagues across this House and support the calls for funding for deaf children's services as outlined by the honourable member for Popular and Limehouse.
Honourable Buck.
Thank you very much, Mr Stringer. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. I would also like to thank the House for making available today a BSL interpreter to follow today's debate. I would also like to thank my honourable friend from Poplar and Limehouse for securing this important debate today on deaf children's services, but also his sterling work on chairing the APPG on deafness. And I'd like to also thank all other honourable members who've spoken. Mr Stringer, many of us, I hope, will have fond memories of school, but we probably take for granted how being able to hear facilitated our learning and socialisation during those times. We are now living in an era where advances in technology and teaching means that deaf children need not be isolated, nor should they be missing out on that vital part of learning and interaction. The tragedy of this debate for me is the fact that they are, and this is a failure that I believe can be laid at the government's door. A toxic combination of government-imposed local authority cuts, education cuts, shambolic rollout of SEND reforms and unfettered off-rolling have led to what the National Deaf Children's Society rightly refer to as stolen futures. Local authority spending on services for children and young people has fallen in real terms by almost £1 billion since 2012, with a £3 billion shortfall predicted by 2025. And just last year, the APPG for Children found that 89% of directors of children's services were struggling to meet their statutory duties towards children in need of support. It is no surprise, as noted by my honourable friend in his opening remarks, that in this environment, over a third of local authorities in England are planning to cut £4 million from their budgets for education support for deaf children this year. As my honourable friend from Hartlepool rightly said, all this will do is exacerbate current issues. The recent steps to ring-fence SEND funding is an inflexible policy, whereby strict rules mean that only 0.5% of a school's overall budget can be transferred to the high needs block. It is also not working, as evidenced by the 27 authorities who have appealed, asking that it be relaxed to meet their local need. Interestingly, the majority of successful appeals have all been in Conservative-led authorities, and I sincerely hope that the Minister is not playing politics with deaf children's services and education. The £50 million announced earlier this year to help local authorities create new places or improve facilities for SEND pupils is also nowhere near good enough. Not only is this not new money, but it is a one-off cash injection, not the sustainable funding that people are crying out for. Of course, with pleasure.
I'm very grateful, and up in the North East we are neighbours, our constituencies are neighbours, so she'll be aware of the situation in Sunderland. I'm sure we have 236 deaf children in Sunderland, and yet the local authority has had their budget cut by 10% to provide the services for these children. And does she agree with me, at a time when we see an increase in the number of deaf children, and also the fact that deaf children now are to be supported up to the age of 25 through the reforms to SEND, which is good, that at this time we should be seeing more support and money put in to support these children rather than cuts?
Thank my honourable friend for that intervention, and the SEND reforms is a topic I'm going to refer to later on in my speech, but I think she aptly leads me on to my next point, which is that when funding and support are denied in cases such as the ones we are talking about today, then so is education denied. In his response, the Minister may likely refer to the funding given to the National Sensory Impairment Partnership and other bodies, but this money does not address the falling numbers of teachers of the deaf. Having British Sign Language trained teachers are vital to deaf children, a point well made by my honourable friend from Nottingham South. And some areas have only one specialist teacher per 100 students. And I was also sorry to hear from my honourable friend from Strangford that this scarcity of teachers is the same in Northern Ireland. And I would like to say to him that I always follow every single word he says, and I love listening to his speeches. Now, none of this should come as any shock, as our schools are facing the first real terms funding cuts in 20 years, with £2.8 billion being cut from their budgets since 2015. And as always, in these austere times, specialist provision is always the first to go. Bamborough School is a specialist school in my constituency. The school is now in the unenviable position of having to pay for their existing teachers to learn BSL Level 1 on a 30-week course out of an existing budget that will take them into a deficit. On top of that, these dedicated teachers are completing the course in what little free time they have. But as their equally dedicated head teacher, Peter Nord, shared with me, he has a duty to the children he teaches, who without BSL would not get the full learning experience that they deserve. Mr. Stringer, not every deaf child or school will have a head and teachers as dedicated as we have in Bamborough or in Elmfield, in my honourable friend from Bristol North West's constituency. And I wonder what will happen to those children. Now, I do appreciate there is a review underway of the SEND workforce in schools, but a report commissioned by the department and published over 2.5 years ago already identified that there is a drastic shortage of deaf teachers. So instead of yet another review to give the appearance of doing something, can the Minister please advise when there might be a response from this review that was taken nearly 3 years ago and what the timescales are for the current ongoing review. The scale of this decrease in support is happening against a backdrop of increasing numbers of children requiring support. In just the last year, the number of deaf children increased by 11%. Earlier this year, it was shown the attainment gap between deaf children and hearing children has widened, the figures for which so ably shared with us by my honourable friend from Bladen. Sadly, the neglect by the government towards deaf children continues as they move throughout their education, with post-16 funding bearing no resemblance at all to the numbers of deaf pupils without an AHC plan. Just last year, Mr Stringer, it was revealed that some county councils in England are charging 16 to 19-year-old SEND students for their transport to the tune of £1,500 a year. And since 2015, students have been required to pay a £200 contribution towards the cost of certain essential equipment that used to be covered by the Disabled Students' Allowance. Parents have told me that often support only comes with an education healthcare plan. Yet, as we've heard, most deaf children do not have such plans. And those that do, as outlined by the Honourable Member for Waveney, have to fight and suffer the exhaustion of taking on the might of their local authorities. A recent and damning report by the Local Government and Social Care Ombudsman found that children and young people were missing out on provision, and health was often a missing factor. As we've heard, 80% of deaf children and young people are not on AHC plans. They rely on SEN support from their local authorities. Support their authorities are struggling with due to savage cuts that have resulted in up to 40,000 deaf children in England without any support at all. They also remain stubbornly overrepresented in alternative provision and exclusion figures. Schools, head teachers, support staff and parents are working tirelessly every day under ever-challenging circumstances to give our deaf children the very best education, an education they deserve. The Minister should really be doing the same, and I look forward to him letting us know his plans. But I would like to, Mr Stringer, if you permit me, end with just a very quick quote from Thomas Bailey, a 16-year-old pupil from Bamborough School in Shields, because he sums up far better than me and far better than any of us here could today the damaging impact of this government's policies. He said, "Being deaf makes me feel depressed and very frustrated. Having no support in school is very mean. When I don't have support, I don't have that person to repeat and break down that information for me and to sign important keywords. So I'm not able to learn the same as other children in class, and I feel left out. Improving equipment would make the sound easier and clearer for me to hear, but having no equipment makes everything very quiet and unclear. This means I am not getting any important information, leaving me feel annoyed and again left out. My life and learning becomes a blank. The Minister should know that unless he takes some urgent action, the despair and emptiness so well articulated by Thomas will continue to be felt by more and more deaf children across our country.
Just before I call the Minister, can I remind him that it would be helpful if he left a couple of minutes for wind-up for the proposer. Minister.
Thank you very much, Mr Stringer. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. I would also like to thank and congratulate my honourable friend, the Member for Poplar and Limehouse, on securing this important debate. Much of his speech, quite rightly, was advocating for the NDCS, and I wanted to let him know at the outset that I'm actually meeting with the NDCS on the 29th of October. I want to also thank many colleagues for participating in this very important debate. The members for Bristol North West and Eastbourne and Hemel Hempstead, as well as the Shadow Minister, really brought home the voice of the different stakeholders in this debate, with the Bolton and Ward family, and of course my honourable friend's daughter as a teacher, and of course the member for Eastbourne's own personal experience. I want to also thank the members for Blaydon, Nottingham South, Strangford, who reminded us of Thomas Edison, of course, who achieved so much with such disadvantage, and Waveney, as well as the member for Lanark and Hamilton East, and for the intervention from my good friend, the member for Washington and Sunderland West. It is, I think, a timely debate following on from my recent meetings with members of the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Deafness. I am grateful for this opportunity, Mr. Stringer, to set out the government's position on supporting children and young people with special educational needs and disabilities, including, of course, those who are deaf and hearing impaired. Last year, it was really great to see the percentage of pupils with hearing impairment getting good GCSEs in English and math increase from 38% in 2011-12 to 46% in 2016-17. And I congratulate those young people who have received their results in August. As my honourable friend, the member for Poplar and Limehouse, pointed out, there is more to do, and I am determined that all children and young people who are deaf or have a hearing impairment receive the support they need to achieve the success they deserve. In the 2014 SEND reforms, I think colleagues would agree they were probably the biggest change to the system in a generation. The reforms are about improving the support available to all children and young people with special educational needs and disability. And I want to be absolutely clear that this vision applies equally to deaf and hearing impaired children and young people. I think we all recognise that we are only part way to achieving our vision of the reformed SEND system. We know there has been a steady movement of children from, with special educational needs out of mainstream schools and into specialist provision. We also recognise the significant consequences, Mr. Stringer, of this trend away from mainstream schools into specialist provision is extra pressures on councils' high needs budgets, which we've heard from many colleagues today. The Secretary of State recently spoke at the Association of Directors of Children's Services conference. He set out his core mission, which I absolutely share, to provide every child with a world-class education, training and care, whatever their background or needs. Our plan to build on the 2014 reforms include equipping and incentivising mainstream schools to work with all pupils, and I'll say a little bit more about that in a few moments, and of course supporting and challenging local authorities and clinical commissioning groups to become more effective planners and commissioners of provision. As you know, Mr. Stringer, in the current financial environment, both central and local government continue to face some very difficult choices. Local authorities are best placed to judge local priorities and to make local funding decisions in consultation with local people and having regard to the range of statutory responsibilities placed on them. But I fully appreciate that this is not easy in times of financial constraint. To support local authorities, the core school funding that this government provides will rise to a record £43.5 billion by 2020, a 50% real terms per pupil increase from 2000. And within this total, the high needs budget for young people in schools and colleges with more complex special educational needs is, as my honourable friend, the member for Poplar and Limehouse mentioned, £6 billion this year. We are keeping this level of funding under careful review, which was one of the questions I think he asked. And this will, of course, be something that we will be discussing with ministerial colleagues in the Treasury as part of the next spending review. I and my officials in the department are engaging with local authorities and schools so that we understand what is driving increasing costs of provision and how we can support them in managing their high needs and wider special needs budgets. The member for Poplar and Limehouse asked about the ring fence on the schools block and whether we can allow more flexibility for local authorities for more funding from schools. There is, I think, a balance to be struck. I'm sure he'll agree with me on protecting spending on mainstream schools and making sure local authorities have enough for high needs. And we are keeping this under revision, as I mentioned earlier. We are particularly interested to ensure that the financial incentives in the current system do not lead local authorities and schools to make decisions that are not in the best interest of their children and young people with special educational needs. As the member for Poplar and Limehouse recognised, I think, local authorities play a crucial strategic leadership role, both in managing special educational needs provision in their area and in overseeing high needs budgets. These responsibilities are discharged most effectively when there is a strong partnership between the local authority and education providers, good engagement with parents and young people, and a shared understanding of where different types of need are best met. The department, Mr. Stringer, has committed £23 million of additional funding to support local authorities to conduct strategic reviews of their SEND provision, and we are investing £265 million of additional capital funding specifically aimed at helping local authorities develop provision for children and young people with education, health and care plans. And responding to his specific point on funding in FE colleges, they do also receive disadvantaged funding, which provides funds to support students with additional needs, including moderate learning difficulties and disabilities. Disadvantaged funding is not ring-fenced, which means institutions are free to use this element of the funding to choose the best way to attract and retain and support those with additional needs. I am very supportive. I will give way.
I thank the Minister for giving way, and I appreciate the reassurance there, but would the Minister agree with me that as it's not ring-fenced, if the NDCS or anyone else can find any evidence that that money's not been used properly for profoundly deaf students between the age of 16 and 18, would he be prepared to review?
Minister.
I'm grateful for his intervention, and I will take that up with the NDCS in my meeting of the 29th to understand the evidence behind that. In addition to the high needs funding that colleges receive, funding which provides funds to support students, the additional element is from areas of economic deprivation based on the index of multiple deprivation, the IMD index, with additional needs, including moderate learning difficulties, as I mentioned earlier. That funding, as I said, is not ring-fenced and actually can be moved. I am very supportive of local authorities working together, and I know that many will be considering how best to support the sensory impaired children and young people in their area, including working closely with neighbouring authorities to provide joint services. That was one of the I think questions from the member for Waveney about joint working to support that. We've established a national network for designated clinical officers, funded a local authority-led regional network and developed resources to support joint self-assessment and peer review, and of course funded a SEND leadership programme and legal training for all local authorities and their health partners to ensure they are clear on their statutory responsibilities as well. I understand that many local authorities have provided information to the National Deaf Children's Society, setting out their plans for sensory support services in the future. My honourable friend, the member for Waveney, has raised particular concerns about provisions in Suffolk. We've provided an additional 140 million in high needs funding this year and will provide an additional 120 million next year. In Suffolk, the local authority will receive 59.9 million in high needs funding this year. I understand that Suffolk has not indicated cuts to funding for deaf services this year. This year, we have contracted with the whole school SEND consortium to deliver a 2-year programme to help embed SEND into school improvements and help schools identify and meet their training needs in relation to SEND. This will, of course, include ensuring schools, including mainstream schools, know where to access the expertise they need to support pupils with hearing impairment. In addition, Mr. Stringer, a team from University College London will be working with the SEND sector to better understand the supply, demand and drivers for SEND training and continuous professional development. This will enable us to target resources at addressing those areas too. The National Sensory Impairment Partnership will be feeding the views of the sensory impairment sector into that work, and we will be reviewing the National Deaf Children's Society's report on local authority funding as part of that work. In addition to this, we have asked Ofsted, Mr. Stringer, to consider how our accountability system can sufficiently reward schools for their work with pupils who need extra support and encourage schools to focus on all pupils, not just the highest achievers. As the member for Poplar and Limehouse stated, the vast majority of deaf children are born to hearing parents who have no prior experience of deafness. That is why the government has separately invested in a number of programs to support children and young people with hearing impairments and their families. We have funded the development of an early support guide for parents of deaf children available through the Council for Disabled Children's website. In addition, we have funded the National Deaf Children's Society iSign project and the development of a family-oriented sign language program, which is available free on the Family Sign Language website. And my honourable friend, the member for Poplar and Limehouse, also asked whether more can be done to ensure school forums include more representations around SEND. Local authorities are required to include at least one representative from a maintained school, special school and a special academy in their area. Many of them extend the representation of special providers by creating SEND subgroups to look specifically at issues relating to children and young people with SEND across the whole age range to 25. And in some areas, there is strong partnership with parent groups so that they are engaged as well. And we need to learn from those areas and spread that good practice out. I'd like to just touch upon a couple of issues that colleagues have mentioned. The member for Hemel Hempstead and Nottingham South talked about the issue of the lack of teachers for deaf and hearing impaired children. To be awarded qualified teacher status, trainees must satisfy the teacher standard, which actually includes a requirement that they have a clear understanding of the needs of all pupils, including those with SEN, and are able to use and evaluate distinctive teaching approaches to engage and support them. And of course, as the Shadow Minister pointed out, we provide 900,000 funding to the National Sensory Impairment Partnership between 2016 and 2018 to equip the school workforce. And the new SEND schools workforce contract with the Whole School Send Consortium, which I mentioned, led by Nason, aims to equip schools to identify and meet their training needs. There was a question on the specialist workforce as well, and the report by the Consortium for Research in Deaf Education, that there has been a 14% reduction in the number of teachers for deaf children over the past 7 years. It is based on an annual survey of local authority specialist educational services, and we'll look at it very carefully, especially in my discussion with NDCS. But the figures, as I understand, do not include teachers of the deaf in special schools, but I will take that up with NDCS. And the member for Blaydon wanted to understand, I think the member from Hemel Hempstead, about British Sign Language and the curriculum. My colleague, the Minister Gibb in the department, has written to NDCS. We are open to considering a proposal for a new GCSE at this stage, for possible introduction during this Parliament. And the development of a new qualification is, of course, lengthy, but we are certainly open to that. Mr. Stringer, I think I shall conclude there to allow my very good friend, the member for Poplar and Limehouse, just to wind up. Thank you very much.
Jim Fitzpatrick to wind up.
Mr. Stringer, I'm very grateful, and I appreciate the responses from the front benches, and I hope that when the Minister has the opportunity to meet NDCS in October, he'll have some good news for them. I have been somewhat encouraged by some of his responses to the questions I have asked him today, but he's heard appeals from everybody who's spoken, and he knows the pressures that have been described, and hopefully he can champion the deaf community in government. I want to thank the Backbench Business Committee, Mr. Stringer, for the opportunity for us to have this debate, to the signers for their sterling work, to the House authorities for providing them with the opportunity to do so, and to all colleagues who have contributed to the debate. Many of them made some very kind comments about myself, and I'm grateful for them, but they apply to everybody who has participated in this debate. All the members of the all-party parliamentary group for deafness and the hard of hearing, who work with and for deaf people, and with great organisations like the National Deaf Children's Society, Action on Hearing Loss, Auditory Verbal, the Ear Foundation, and so many others. Deaf people don't want charity, Mr. Stringer. We know that. They want fairness. This debate demonstrates that we here collectively get that, and hopefully the government gets it too. Thank you very much.
Question is that this House has considered deaf children's services. As many other of that opinion say aye, of the contrary no, I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Order, order. Thank you.